Madam Chair, I come to the floor today to once again talk about Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. Before I do, though, I want to pause for a minute and honor the lives lost in the downing of Malaysian Airlines flight MH17 over Ukraine, knocked down by Russian and Russian-backed separatists. This week marks the 8th anniversary of that tragedy. All 238 passengers and 15 crew were killed. This 8th anniversary is a reminder that Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine didn't just start this spring. 8 years ago, the people of Ukraine made a courageous choice. They said that they were going to stand up to a corrupt Russian-backed regime, and when they did that, Russia responded by invading their country, taking Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula, but also territory here in what's called the Donbass. So this is not new. For almost 9 years, the people of Ukraine have been fighting this war with Russia. More recently, of course, the invasion was even more devastating. So I join Bridget Brink, who's our new U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who said, quote, "We honor the memories of those killed 8 years ago, even as missiles continue to fall on Mykolaiv, Dnipro, and other Ukrainian cities, killing civilians and demonstrating the Kremlin's disregard for international law and human life," end quote. She's right. Ambassador Brink said it right. The civilian toll in this war is devastating. Ukraine's Prosecutor General recently said that since late February of this year, 353 children have died in this war, and more than 1,000 have been wounded. The Associated Press painted a vivid picture of this with a story about the killing of a 4-year-old girl named Liza. Liza Dmitrieva. Liza had Down syndrome and was on her way to see a speech therapist last Thursday when her mother and she were attacked by Russian missiles. She was in a town called Vinistia. At least 24 people were killed that day, including Liza, and 2 boys who were 7 and 8 years old. Almost 200 were wounded. Liza's mother is still in intensive care. It's important to know that when the war started, Liza's family fled Kyiv, but stayed in Ukraine, fleeing to this town, Vinistia, about 167 miles southwest of Kyiv. They thought they could be safe there. It's well behind enemy lines. It's well behind the front lines of the battle. And yet, this is the reality of President Putin's war on Ukraine. It is targeting civilians, but it won't just stop in Ukraine. This is why Finland and Sweden, in a move that just a few years ago would have seemed impossible, left a history of neutrality behind and joined NATO. Their application is currently in place. They see President Putin's brutal war, and they know that they could be next. Last week, I mentioned on the floor that as recently as 2016, President Putin said, quote, "The borders of Russia never end," end quote. It bears repeating because he and other Kremlin leaders seem intent on restoring the Russian Empire, even if it means rolling over other free and independent countries. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee took a momentous step today by voting to ratify the NATO applications for these 2 allies of the United States, Sweden and Finland. I was proud to vote to ratify and speak in committee about why this expansion is so good for our national security. To have these 2 countries with strong militaries, a strong economy, join our NATO alliance. I hope that the leadership of the Senate will put this legislation on the floor as soon as possible so that we can show the world that we are enthusiastically supporting the joining of these 2 countries to the NATO alliance. We need to continue to demonstrate global solidarity in this war. President Putin, of course, had hoped to divide NATO and divide Europe and divide the West, but he underestimated what would happen. He underestimated the foresight and wisdom of the people of Sweden and Finland, just as he underestimated the courage and resiliency of the people of Ukraine. On the energy front, a significant development that isn't getting nearly enough attention happened last week. Back in June, Russia cut gas to Europe via Nord Stream 1 pipeline by 60% because of, quote, maintenance problems. They claimed they needed gas turbines that had gone to Canada to be repaired to be able to continue the flow of the pipeline. Those turbines were prohibited from being returned to Russia because of the sanctions that are in place with regard to Russian energy infrastructure. Of course, what President Putin's government claims to be true is often not. The reality is Russia was punishing Europe and trying to poke holes in the Western sanctions regime. Unfortunately, the Russians succeeded. What happened next was discouraging. Canada gave in to Russia's demands last week and returned the gas turbines. And then the State Department applauded this move, saying that somehow it was standing up to Russia's energy blackmail. I understand the administration's desire to preserve Allied unity in the face of Russian aggression. That's important, especially in our effort to stand up against Russia over the long term. But if we're unified behind a bad policy, then that unity doesn't do us much good. We saw this with Nord Stream 2, remember, when the Biden administration sided with Germany to remove sanctions on the pipeline, even though that decision undermined the security of our allies, including Ukraine. And I think it sent the wrong message to Russia, and is one reason that they felt empowered to invade Ukraine more recently. And now we're seeing the same thing here. In the name of preserving unity with certain allies, we are giving in to Russia's demands. As I said, unity with our allies is important. I get that. But instead of settling for weak policy, we should be pushing our allies to adopt stronger policies against Russia, including with regard to energy. Unfortunately, Russia knows that by manufacturing a, quote, maintenance problem with their pipelines, our allies tend to back down on our sanctions. I wonder, when will the next maintenance problem appear? President Zelensky has called the return of these gas turbines to Russia, quote, absolutely unacceptable, end quote. But the Biden administration characterized it as a counter to Russia's attempt to weaponize energy. This just isn't the case. It's worth noting that another crisis is looming as a result of this war and is the direct result of Russia's blockade of Ukraine's ports, especially the port at Odessa. Here's the Odessa port. There are other ports along this area into the Black Sea that are absolutely essential for Ukraine's exports, and yet Russia is blocking them. Here I cannot overstate the importance of this issue, as Ukraine supplies so much of the world's food, and without ports to export, that food is not making it to the people who need it badly, and it is causing food shortages around the world. Let me be clear, food should never be used as a weapon of war, but that's exactly what President Putin is doing. The effects are far-reaching. According to the World Food Program, increases in the cost of food and fuel since March have caused 47 million people to experience food insecurity. And of those, some 50 million are living close to famine, and that number grows every single day. To be specific, according to the Wall Street Journal, and I quote, in Somalia, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Yemen, and Afghanistan, nearly 900,000 people already face starvation and death. That is more than tenfold the increase from 2019, and by some estimates could result in more people dying from hunger in 2022 and 2023 than in any year since the 1960s, and China's disastrous Great Leap Forward agricultural policies, end quote. Wow. The World Food Program provides aid for these countries, but there are shortages because of Russia's war of choice, and the cost of that aid has risen tremendously. They report that their costs have jumped 46% compared with 2019. That's about 50% over the last few years, and any organization, let alone one that provides humanitarian aid, would have immense problems keeping up. There are increases in everyday items, like vegetable oils and special nutritional paste given to children who are in famine or malnourished. While these problems persist, it's the most vulnerable among us that truly feel the cost of malnourishment. It's the kids and the children who are most at risk from the effects of hunger. Their bodies, from a lack of nutrients from food, are too weak to fight off diseases such as measles or cholera. Even those who survive these terrible illnesses will often face long-term health problems that could impact them forever. So we're not only facing a brutal invasion of Ukraine. We've talked about that. War crimes are being committed there every day. But there is also a humanitarian crisis that is taking its toll around the world as we speak as a result of this war on Ukraine and the blockade of these ports. This is a battle on so many fronts, and we have to face the realities of this head-on. In a war that was thought to be over within weeks, the fighting has continued well beyond that and may continue for much longer. It has already gone on longer than most people expected, and while Ukrainians continue to show their fortitude and strength, the world feels the effects of this through the global fallout. Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenska, will speak to Congress tomorrow about the damaging effects of this war, just as her husband, President Zelensky, addressed these chambers in March. I look forward to hearing what she has to say. She's been a passionate advocate for the rights of innocent Ukrainian citizens who have been killed and wounded by these Russian attacks. She's even started her own initiative to address the mental health impacts of Russia's terrible war and the trauma that the people of Ukraine have experienced. That's the kind of leadership Ukraine needs. Frankly, it's the kind of leadership the world needs. She and her husband should be commended for their bravery in the face of tyranny and their steadfastness through the destruction that Vladimir Putin has caused her beloved homeland. In Ukraine, the stakes remain high. The casualties, both civilian and professional soldier alike, go into the thousands. Thousands. The damage to Ukraine's infrastructure, their beautiful cities, ports, schools, hospitals, daycares, and apartment buildings goes into the billions. This is a photograph of an apartment building that was recently bombed in the eastern part of Ukraine, killing, of course, innocent civilians. According to the Kyiv School of Economics, Ukraine will need at least $165 billion for post-war reconstruction. Per their latest update, almost half of those losses is attributable to housing losses like this one. Civilian targets of Russia's unrelenting bombing campaign. Neighborhoods, residential areas, homes, apartments have been hit by these Russian airstrikes. These are acts of terror. I'm a sponsor of Senator Graham's resolution to urge the Biden administration to name Russia a state sponsor of terror. I urge leadership to bring this to a vote. We voted it out of committee already. It's on the floor. Let's take it up. So what happens next? We know that making any territorial concessions to Russia would only embolden President Putin and other future would-be conquerors. The lesson they would learn is that with enough patience, they can wear down the West and get what they want. We must not let that happen, and the people of Ukraine and the brave president certainly know this. We must do more quickly to arm Ukraine and help them to be able to protect themselves and to be able to win this war. It is clear that President Putin underestimated the courage, the effectiveness, and the resiliency of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian military. And now President Putin knows what the Ukrainians are capable of. And by the way, the Russian forces also understand this. On Monday, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu told Russian troops to hit Ukraine's high-mobility artillery rocket systems, or HIMARS. He asked them to do so because of the success the Ukrainians have had with just 8 of these HIMARS units. These are systems from the United States. Many of us have pushed very hard to get these to Ukraine. They went too late. Many lives were lost, and cities were flattened because they did not have them early on. These rocket systems are absolutely essential because before that, the Russians could sit back and indiscriminately bomb Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, and the Ukrainian artillery could not reach them. These HIMARS systems have a longer range and are more accurate, and they've been quite effective. Only 8 systems are there now, also 3 from the UK, a few from Germany. They need a lot more. But just this week, because of these systems, Ukrainian forces killed a Russian commander after HIMARS hit a Russian control and command center here in the south of Ukraine. Last week, HIMARS took out a Russian ammunition warehouse in this same region. They've now taken out a couple of dozen of these ammo depots, especially here in the south and here in the east. That's incredibly important because by reducing the Russian ammunition stores, it will be much more likely that the Russians will realize that this war is damaging them, their equipment, their soldiers, and be more willing to come to the bargaining table. If this is what the Ukrainians can do with just 8 HIMARS, imagine what they could do with what they've been asking for and what they really need, which is around 40 or 50 of these units. These weapons are crucial to the brave Ukrainian fighters as Ukraine continues its effort to defend itself from these Russian airstrikes and missile strikes. Finally, Ukrainian forces have missiles with adequate range to reach these Russian missiles, to reach these ammo depots, to reach these command posts. Russia will still have the advantage, of course, of more missiles, more men, more rockets, and their attacks are relentless. President Zelensky highlighted this when he said on Monday that Russia has fired thousands of cruise missiles and rockets during this war. Thousands. These often come in the middle of the night and hit residential areas and city infrastructure in places like Nikopol, a city that's located here, right near Kherson. Rockets have also hit apartment complexes, as we saw, and shopping malls. Here's a shopping mall that Russians attacked a few weeks ago. This is a shopping mall much as you would see in the United States of America. It was full of people who were out shopping on a summer day, maybe buying clothes, maybe buying some food. Over 20 shoppers were killed at this shopping center, and over 56 people were wounded. This shopping center, by the way, was in the central part of Ukraine. If you look at the map, this is not anywhere near the war zone. More up in this area in the middle part of Ukraine. So bombings of shopping centers, apartments, schools, hospitals. It's really hard to imagine, but it's happening. We can help Ukraine fight back. Again, the best way is to provide them with more weapons, like the HIMARS that they need. We have hundreds in our stocks, by the way. It is more critical than ever that the United States and our allies support Ukraine to try to turn the tide. Only that will get Russia to the bargaining table. Meanwhile, we must continue to expose the brutality. Much of the media attention has gone away, while lives continue to be lost and cities continue to be bombarded. We need to keep letting people know about these atrocities. That's why I'm here on the floor of the Senate for the 18th consecutive week to talk about what's happening to the people of Ukraine, what's happened in the past week, and why they deserve and need our help. Ukrainians are fighting because they know what it's like to live under the thumb of authoritarianism. They've been subject to that through their history. And more recently, they broke away from that and towards democracy in 1991 and again in 2014. It's important to note that Ukraine is not asking us to fight this war for them. They just want us to help them, along with our allies, to be able to have the tools they need to protect themselves. They're asking us for increased lethal military assistance to help defend themselves. And they're asking all of us to abide by the commitments that we have made. In 1994, after the Berlin Wall came down, Ukraine signed what's called the Budapest Memorandum. It was a treaty where Ukraine agreed to give up all of its nuclear weapons, and they had a lot of them, in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the United States of America, and the United Kingdom. Guarantees that we would all respect the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine and refrain from the threat or use of force against Ukraine. That was in 1994. So much for Russia's commitment. I've seen the spirit and perseverance of Ukrainians firsthand when I have visited the country. I've been there 7, 8, 9 times. I was there right after the Revolution of Dignity, as it's called, in 2014, where Ukrainians decided to turn away from a Russian-backed and corrupt government and stand with us and Europe to pursue a hopeful future of freedom and democracy. Now it's time for us and our allies to stand with them. The world must know that freedom-loving countries around the globe have Ukraine's back, and we will be there until the bitter end. President Putin must know that we will not back down as he orders the ruthless slaughter of more innocents. At the beginning of my speech, I talked about this 4-year-old girl. Liza's death occurred because of these rocket attacks. At her funeral, Orthodox priest Vitaly Holoskovich said this, and I quote, "We know that evil cannot win. We know that evil cannot win." And maybe that's the bottom line here today. This is a struggle between freedom and democracy and the right of self-determination on the one hand, and evil on the other hand. Evil of conquest, the evil of authoritarianism, the evil of tyranny, now is not the time to be tentative or equivocal. At this critical juncture, we need to work with our allies to provide Ukraine what they need to defeat evil, to protect their homeland, and to defend democracy. Thank you, and I yield the floor.